Greetings, worshippers of the fly god Sriptic, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
And now for an episode literally nobody asked for. In 2018, we did an episode looking at the very first issue of White Dwarf from 1977. It featured no Warhammer since neither fantasy nor 40k existed yet. In fact, it was mostly articles related to Dungeons & Dragons, which Games Workshop were an importer of at the time.
For quite a while, White Dwarf would stay pretty much just like that, primarily focused on D&D with articles for other RPGs, wargames and other miscellaneous tabletop pursuits, until gradually Games Workshop's own products began to dominate the magazine. However, we'd like to focus on those earlier issues today, specifically the first 70-ish. Not because the covers from that era were decorated with beautiful examples of old fantasy art, looking just like the covers of those old fantasy books you'd find at a second-hand bookshop and are really curious to read, but don't because you're already like 30 books behind on reading the Horus Heresy series, and oh my god, they've released like 2 more since you started this thought process, so you can't waste any time on anything else, you must read them, you must consume, you can never know peace.
But because it also contained Fiend Factory.
Fiend Factory was a column that appeared in most issues of White Dwarf in one form or another from 1978 to 1986, spanning issues 6 to 73. It was a repository of homebrew monsters for Dungeons & Dragons, occasionally made by the magazine, but mostly submitted by readers. The column was initially edited by Don Turnbull, who was later replaced by Albi Fiore, who would edit it for most of its run, and it was a thing of beauty. The fiends featured in early editions were mostly novelty monsters, sometimes something simple like the teleporting Blink skeleton, but often they were nasty surprises to spring on your players, like the Disenchanter, a weird vacuum camel that would permanently suck the magic out of magical items. Much like J.J. Abrams. As it went on, the monsters generally became more grounded, and the column would often introduce whole races, even on a couple of occasions including a pantheon of gods for them, that you could kill.
Those that submitted their monsters and got them published didn't just get to bask in the glow of seeing their creation inflicted upon an unsuspecting public either. They also got 1 free issue of White Dwarf per monster published. How much did White Dwarf cost at the time? 50p. Oh. Well, counting for inflation, that was the equivalent of like 2 whole British pounds back then, so yeah.
There are far too many monsters to show you from Fiend Factory, so we thought we'd do something a little different for this video. We went through every issue we could find that had a Fiend Factory in it, so that's about 60 issues and literally hundreds of monsters. And we picked our top 10 favourite creatures, that we shall now put in front of your eyeballs in list format.
Because, as every YouTuber knows, top 10 lists are the easiest videos to write.
Let's do this.
Iron pigs are porcine prototype versions of iron golems. They can only be hit by magic weapons of +3 or better and breathe out puffs of chlorine gas. And the idea of an adorable robot pig that's actually a mildly invulnerable murder machine that emits poison with every breath is just amusing to us. Oh, and for those that remember the Monster Mark system from White Dwarf issue 1, you know, the system for assessing how dangerous enemies were using capital M maths, well, those people may have noticed that some of the entries that we've been showing have a Monster Mark value. This is probably because the editor of the column also came up with the Monster Mark system, so he's the only person who actually understands it.
Spider dragons are 2-foot-tall, camouflaged, man-eating dragons. They eat limbs whole, spit acid, and love precious gems in the same way that I love Citadel miniatures, as in you'll always find 1 to 6 of them in their stomach. This one was designed by Ian Livingstone, who you may know as one of the founders of Games Workshop and the editor of White Dwarf at the time. This one is in here mostly because, well, I'm gonna be honest with you, I had a bit to drink when we were finalising this list and I may have gotten a little too enamoured with the term spider dragon to let it go.
When you see the monster entry for NILBOG, you're probably thinking, fun reference to Troll 2 there, and then most likely picture that guy going, oh my god, with a fly on his face. But no, the infamously terrible film Troll 2 came out in 1990, and the NILBOG entry was from the first Fiend Factory in issue 6 from 1978. So this could only be a reference to Troll 2 if some kind of distortion in the fabric of space-time occurred, which admittedly would be quite fitting. NILBOG, as fans of spelling words will know, is goblin backwards. In gameplay terms, NILBOGs were identical to goblins in every respect except for one big difference. Damaging it heals it. The only way to make it lose hit points was to heal it via a spell or force-feeding it a potion somehow. Why? To screw with your players, obviously. A goblin isn't going to really do much damage, but it's probably going to take a while before the party figures out how to hurt it. But why in-universe? Well, the author does give a reason for this peculiar creature. Basically, the heavy use of magic in an area can create space-time distortions, and NILBOGs are a manifestation of that. Many issues later, we also had the Lort, which was a troll infected with NILBOGism, who, rather than regenerating health each round, would lose 3 hit points.
Stair stalkers are green hairy monsters with an obsession for staircases. That's it. That's their whole thing. The Russian doll monster is a pretty simple but pretty fun idea based off those Russian nesting dolls. It starts off as a stone giant, but after 10 HP is taken off it, its skin peels back to reveal a hill giant. 10 more HP later, the same process happens again, but this time it becomes an ogre. Then a bugbear, then a gnoll, then a hobgoblin, then an orc, then a goblin, then a kobold, and then when the kobold is killed, a leprechaun who was controlling the whole thing will spring from the corpse, turn invisible, steal something valuable from the party, and attempt to escape. We like this one since, even once the party has gotten used to the idea of how this monster works, it has that one final trick that will probably leave the party missing an item after what could be a pretty rough fight. And by like, we mean we hope that no DM we know ever uses it against us. Although the name is a little strange, calling it a Russian doll monster insinuates that there's a Russia in whatever D&D world you're playing in. Personally, I would have called the monster a Matryoshka, but you know, I'm not in 1979, so it's a bit easier for me to just Google what those dolls are actually called so I can sound very clever.
One of the things that separates the earlier Fiend Factory columns from the latter ones is that the monsters got a fun stylised logo version of their name that tied into whatever the monster was. So the Bone Snapper got one that was made of bones, that kind of thing. Although they did have the habit of occasionally not using the monster's name in the entry itself, so if the stylised version was hard to read, then you were in trouble. The number 5 monster is a particularly bad example of this. After hours of research and trial and error, we're pretty sure that it's supposed to be CHAOTICUS SYMBIOTICUS. But it's not exactly like we can check anywhere. Hell, when it was printed again later in the Fiend folio, put a pin in that, its name was changed to the much simpler Symbiotic Jelly. Anyway, the CHAOTICUS SYMBIOTICUS, if indeed that is its name, was a little blob of yellow jelly that would hang out on the ceiling of its lair. Should a powerful monster wander in, the jelly would cast 2 illusions. The first would make the monster appear much less dangerous than it is, and the second would create an illusory treasure in the room. Anyone killed by the monster would be eaten by it, and the jelly would drain the creature for its own sustenance. So, if you happen to see a lone kobold guarding an unreasonably large treasure chest in a cave somewhere, that kobold could secretly be, I don't know, an Umber Hulk, and the treasure it's guarding is secretly getting smashed in the face repeatedly by an Umber Hulk.
A SQUONK is, as well as a very fun word to say, a small vole-like creature covered in warts and blemishes that is impervious to magic. It is usually crying and covering up its face because it's so ugly, and if attacked will simply dissolve into tears. However, if you manage to befriend it, then it can be used as a very stealthy scout, especially useful since it can recount the information it gets back to you in common, or its own SQUONK language if you happen to be able to speak that for some reason. The entry suggests that befriending this creature would appeal to female players more than their male counterparts, and although reinforcing nonsense stereotypes whilst doing it, the fact that a magazine from 1978 acknowledges that a woman might actually want to play Dungeons & Dragons feels oddly progressive, so grats to GW, I guess. The SQUONK is seemingly based on a mythical creature of the same name from Pennsylvania, the first known written account of which was in William T. Cox's 1910 book, Fearsome Creatures of the Lumberwoods with a Few Desert and Mountain Beasts. A book that feels just a few stats away from being a Fiend Factory column itself, containing such fun vintage cryptids as the Hugag, the Wapaloosie, and the Tote Road Shagamore.
In issue 50, the Fiend Factory was themed around allowing you to use various characters from White Dwarf in both D&D and also RuneQuest, a fantasy RPG from Chaosium, who you may know as the company that publishes Call of Cthulhu. This column included characters from the various comics that ran in White Dwarf, like Gobbledygook or Ben Solo, Thrud, not to mention the White Dwarf himself, Grombrindle, although he doesn't seem to have picked up that particular name yet. However, the entry that gets third place is a name we mentioned earlier, Ian Livingstone. Yes, this entry is a tongue-in-cheek ribbing of the magazine's editor, with such gems as his race being human, his class being editor, a rare subclass of thief, possessing cash, none, if it's his round, and his alignment being barwards. Although considering that his HP is listed simply as lots and the niche appeal of this reference, I'm not sure how many people would have actually tried to use him in a game of AD&D. In fact, I'm starting to suspect that that entry may in fact be a joke.
Sometimes they use Fiend Factory to create more than just a single monster and would make a whole race, such as the case in issue 23 when we got FLYMEN. They are flies, and also men. It is not a clever name. They're kind of like those fly aliens from that one Doctor Who episode, but half an inch tall. If encountered normally, then they have all the same stats, and can still hurt you with their poison-tipped blades. But if you have been magically transformed to be the same size as them, there's individual stats for drones, artisans, warriors, fly guards, and fly mages. The latter two possess magical size rods, don't laugh, that can change things from flyman to human-sized or vice versa, so they even have a built-in hook as to how you can get shrunk. There's a ton of background information on them too, like in their own language they're called the Hurl, like girl, but with an H. Most of them worship an insect god called Struptek, and there's even a couple of variant versions of them, like the Northfly, who are a more tribal take on them that are resistant to cold but weak to fire, and the Sandfly, desert-dwelling flymen who are big into trading and plundering and whose fly mages are huge fans of fire spells. The issue goes even further by adding a whole scenario involving them, including the contents of every room for an entire hive, giving even more lore details on them. For example, the tiny lamps in their hives burn beeswax for light and are maintained by a guild of lamp tenders. Although one of the strangest bits of detail is that it's explicitly mentioned that the outer casing of a flyman's head is strong enough to survive being hollowed out and worn as a mask, which is really messed up when you think about it. Oh wait, technically we need to pick just one of them for number 2. Fly Guard, because they have cool helmets and they also ride wasps.
Okay, before we do number 1, we'd like to give a few honourable mentions. There's the Mimble, a rodent-like creature that throws itself on your sword because it's just kinky like that. The Bonacon, a bull with flatulence so powerful that its winged variety can use it as jet propulsion, blame Pliny the Elder for that one. The Gluey, which is a mummy but sticky. The Heteronormativity Tree, and the Zirasoni, a literal two-headed eagle doing its thing long before Lord Inquisitor Cotiaz decided to be so on the nose about the whole two-headed Aquila thing. But our number 1 entry is... Have you ever looked at a horse and thought, I just don't trust you? Well, the SYMBIOTICUS is 50% horse that you should 100% not trust. No one knows how or why these mules possess psychic powers, but what we do know is that its unique abilities require fuel, and they have a taste for human flesh. Also, they enjoy killing. SYMBIOTICUS use their powers not only to mind blast people, but to lure them in by projecting an illusion upon itself to appear just like a regular mule, but with saddlebags fully laden with treasure. It also bites. This is a bad mule. This is a very bad mule, but it's also number 1 on our list.
Obviously, this list is entirely subjective, and we tend to be more enamoured with the sillier entries, but we do hope this gave you an idea of the sort of things that you could find in Fiend Factory. Also, 4 of them were by Roger Musson, so I guess he got a lot of free White Dwarfs back in the day. However, many of the monsters didn't stay trapped in the magazine-y confines of White Dwarf. Many would show up again in the official AD&D book, the Fiend Folio, Tome of Creatures, Malevolent and Benign. This book was released in 1981, was organised much like the Monster Manual, and was edited by Don Turnbull, the guy from earlier who originally edited Fiend Factory. Most of the monsters appearing again would be retooled and elaborated upon in this incarnation, although becoming official did lead to Citadel having to discontinue many of the miniatures it had released based on the column. Because, yeah, did we forget to mention some of these got minis? So if you absolutely needed a miniature of, say, a slime beast or an assassin bug, then yeah, you could get them.
Another interesting point is that the Fiend Folio doesn't mention Games Workshop or White Dwarf anywhere, simply saying that the Fiend Factory column was a regular feature in a UK magazine. We assume that this is probably down to some kind of rights issue again, unless Don Turnbull had an axe to grind with GW for some reason and left them out on purpose.
Oh, and by the way, the word you're looking for is they, Don. It's been used in the English language as a singular pronoun for centuries. Why you gotta be weird about it?
But we know what some of you are thinking. Can any of these still be used in D&D today?
The short answer is yes.
Since so many monsters from Fiend Factory were made official in the Fiend Folio, plenty of them are still around. For example, the Hook, Horror and Grell, both introduced in issue 12 of White Dwarf, can be found in the current D&D Monster Manual, and NILBOGs can be found in the expansion book Volo's Guide to Monsters, where they are now goblins possessed by trickster spirits and work a fair bit differently. But due to the nature of D&D, you could totally make an old-fashioned NILBOG if you wanted. Hell, pretty much anything in here that hasn't been carried into the modern era could be recreated with a bit of imagination. So
if any of you out there are DMs, we highly encourage you to take a look at Fiend Factory if you can.
Then, if your party are ignoring your adventure hooks, then you can just fill their world full of PSI-MULEs and watch them never trust a mount again.